We've seen the same battle over and over and over. It's like China and the US can't stop hitting the rematch button, whilst the rest of the world spectates. But instead of someone losing a game and going on with their lives, the aftermath that's left when these two countries clash destroys livelihoods and entire economies. Whether it's TikTok, technology, labor costs, or genuine war threats, the outcome is almost always the same, with their relationship being described as symbiotic. With the current controversy, it's almost like a back and forth between the US and China, and Apple is just caught in the middle of it. In a bid to see who can generate the most amount of wealth, Apple and other large companies in the US were in a race to the bottom. And what I mean by this is that in an attempt to make the most profit, they're all rushing down to get the cheapest and reliable supplier, aka China. As a result of Apple putting majority of their eggs in one basket, it's left them extremely vulnerable. But before we get into what actually happened, we have to find out why China is so vital to the US. Despite the widespread belief that Apple products are produced in China because of low labor costs, this is only part of the story. Originally, Steve Jobs transferred most of Apple's manufacturing to China, specifically Shenzhen, because it was the only country in the world with a massive ready-made supply chain network. This meant that China had the ability to scale up production for any company overnight, and this was due to three factors. First of all, the city is strategically placed, serving as a gateway between China and Hong Kong, and being one of the largest shipping centers in the world, transport is very accessible. Secondly, the Chinese government designated Shenzhen as the first special economic zone, or SEZ. Essentially, these are special zones with relaxed planning regulations for companies and generous tax breaks. This, combined with geographical advantages, has allowed these zones to grow at this rate. And thirdly is time. The SEZ in Shenzhen was established back in 1980, giving the city more than 40 years to develop. Apple also relies on many suppliers and subcontractors. Majority of them are based in Shenzhen, so it makes sense for Apple to bring everything into one place for assembly. Although you may be thinking that the conditions were perfect and nothing could go wrong, you'd be terribly mistaken. Greed, power, human nature. Apple sees $160 billion cut off its value after China extends its curbs on iPhone use by the government workers just 2 days before the iPhone 15 is released. Huawei smartphone sales are predicted to leap by 65%. Shares in Apple have tumbled by 6.4% in just 2 days. What happened? It all started in 2019. The US government, under the presidency of Donald Trump, enforced numerous sanctions that cut off Huawei from two key technologies that were necessary for the company to compete in the market. At first, Huawei were cut off from using 5G chips in their phones. These chips were a revolutionary technology that optimized signals, improved efficiency, and produced batteries that could last all day. The reason for this sanction is that American officials suspected Huawei and the Chinese government were closely linked. They were concerned that technologies like 5G telecommunications equipment were being used as surveillance tools. But to no one's surprise, they denied the allegations. But this wasn't it. Arguably the most devastating sanction was Google's decision to stop licensing the Android operating system to Huawei. This meant that consumers of Huawei couldn't have access to the operating systems or Google services that they've used for decades and have come to expect. And the results were devastating. Huawei responded with a seemingly calm public statement. We will continue to build a safe software ecosystem to provide the best experience for all users. But the whole world saw right through their confident facade. Huawei heavily relies on Android for the smartphones it sells outside of China. The reason this is important is because almost half of Huawei's shipments in the first quarter of 2019 were to markets outside of mainland China. So we can see how devastating it is that Huawei couldn't use Android. Some even describing it as an instant kill switch for Huawei's ambition to overtake Samsung in the global market. Oh, but it doesn't end there. The company also relies on over 30 American suppliers for its key components. Some of these companies stated that they would not sell to Huawei until further notice. And the barrage of sanctions didn't stop for years, with the Biden administration clamping down on the previous restrictions in 2023, restricting the sales of semiconductors to 36 Chinese companies. The US also convinced Japan and the Netherlands to join its efforts to bar the shipment of their high-tech machinery to China. And so it seemed as though the downfall of the Huawei smartphone was set in stone. However, they didn't just sit by idly, and here is where it gets complicated. In early September of 2023, just days before the release of the iPhone 15, rumors were circulating around the internet of China's apparent ban of the iPhone for government workers and state-owned companies. The Guardian reported that several agencies and at least one state-owned company had instructed their employees that anyone working with trade secrets couldn't bring any Apple products into work. To a lot of people, this made sense. This was simply done in response to all the restrictions thrown out by the US. In response to this news, Apple's market shares fell more than 6% in just 2 days, meaning Apple lost almost $200 billion. The reason this happened is because China is one of Apple's biggest markets and generates nearly a fifth of its revenue. In fact, Greater China, which includes Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan, accounted for nearly 19% of its sales last year. But only days after the rumors went wild, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson in China stated that China has not issued any laws, regulations, or policy documents prohibiting the purchase and use of mobile phones from foreign brands such as Apple. However, the situation was all too suspicious and perfectly timed right before the release of Apple's phone. China also had the motive to do something like this due to the fact that previous sanctions cost China hundreds of millions. So it would only make sense for them to sabotage the release of the iPhone 15. But this counterattack made by China didn't change the fact that Huawei was slowly losing its reputation, so their only option was to diversify.
Huawei, China's top chip maker, have built an advanced processor to power its latest smartphone. It's a sign that Beijing is making early progress in a nationwide push to overcome US sanctions. Huawei has been at the center of intensifying US trade curbs on Chinese businesses, which Washington says are based on national security concerns.
So it wasn't clear exactly where it got these chips or how it got these chips. Unlike most technology companies that love to talk about specs, Huawei didn't say anything about the specs here, especially the key ones.
Huawei released this new chip with the release of the Mate 60 Pro just this month. The previous, now banned chips were made by a Taiwanese chip maker called TSMC. Up to this point, there was no company that could do what TSMC could, but this is exactly why the world was shocked when Huawei released their new phone that combined the processor and components for what appeared to be 5G connectivity.
I was going to ask, so why does the speed of the chips inside this Huawei phone, why does it matter? And you've given us a bit on that already. It signifies then that China is moving faster than the rest of the world had anticipated in moving to these faster chips. Is that the basics of the story?
That's right. That's right. The U.S., you'll recall that last year the Biden administration imposed export controls on China. And it was trying to draw a line in the sand where China would not have access to chips that were more sophisticated than 14 nanometer, which is about 7 years beyond the latest cutting edge technology. And now China has shown that actually internally in China, it can make these 7 nanometer chips, which are only about 5 years behind the latest technologies.
And although Huawei hasn't confirmed the phone is 5G capable, reviews of the device have shown that it's capable of hitting download speeds associated with 5G. With the incredible rise and comeback of Huawei and the slight yet recent decline of Apple, the future of these two companies is currently unknown, but one thing is for sure. China is critical to Apple's success, but Apple is just as critical to the Chinese economy.